Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking about how transport infrastructure does more than just move people. It's an opportunity to express the identity of cities and countries. Doesn't work. Not technology. Right. I'm going to open with a slide which hopefully is familiar to you all because it's something which resonated very much with me. I started my education here at Manchester University, being a Londoner, and I remember only like yesterday of walking down from Piccadilly and coming in through the heart of the Industrial Revolution. It was a very different feeling and a different environment to what I was used to. And it's really what inspired me to just looking around you. You've just got to see this is like, whether it's the canal system, it's infrastructure right there in your face. And it's something which not only inspired me, but other architects and designers over the years. Sir Norman Foster studied here and various other designers. And that made me go into infrastructure and have a passion for it. That's me as a 23-year-old at Grimshaw Architects, working on a very important project because it was the Eurostar terminal. It was the first time the Channel Tunnel had come in to link the UK and France. So it was a significant piece of infrastructure. And it was interesting how we looked at the design of that. I'm an industrial designer by training, so we work with architecture, so we look at the customer touch points. But that really got me into infrastructure. Another person who was again a Manchester student and a contemporary of Sir Norman Foster was this chap called Roland Paletti. And anyone who'd worked on the Jubilee line, and I know there's a few people here, he was our leader. And I worked very closely with Roland for a period of 6 years, sat next to him. And he was a very inspirational chap and a mentor. And his background, he came from Pierluigi Nervi, the engineering, and to Basil Spence, and he'd just come over to the UK, brought over with a lot of the engineers from building the Hong Kong system. And this is his quote. And we were sort of days of infrastructure, and especially station design. Everything was focused on the train, and almost the buildings were sort of like an unnecessary interference. And he blew that up, that whole idea, and he said you have to decide at the beginning whether you're going to see an underground station as a kind of vernacular underpass that happens to have people in it, or whether it's a building. It's a building with some kind of job to do, like making people uncomfortable. And that was very inspirational of how he approached bringing fantastic architects in and also making sure that a grand cathedral-like station of Canary Wharf had the same level of detail as maybe in a station like this in London Bridge. And that's where I was involved. Our team designed what we call the kit of parts, or the line-wide components, the customer touch points that you can see here on London Bridge station. But really, it's not just about looking at the detail and the design. We need to think a bit more holistically. And a lot of tenders we're seeing at the moment ask for world-class, international best practice. I'm going to be slightly controversial here and say there's no such thing as international best practice. It's about designing and understanding the needs of the city and the country, which are very different, and we've had the opportunity to work around the world and experience that. I can probably tell you something which went wrong for us, and it wasn't in Australia, it was actually in Shanghai. We were asked by Shanghai Metro to take their sign guidelines and make them world-class, come up to international best practice. And we did that with a very North European view, a very monochronic view on how potentially they don't need this guideline of 400 pages. We reduced it all down We thought that we were taking the stress about this multiple layers of information. And what we found out was we completely misunderstood how people in China understood information. We thought it would be a progressive disclosure of information, but they come from an understanding or a background of polychronic, where they are used to absorbing a high level of information all in one time. So, as designers, we did the fundamental wrong thing of not understanding our user. So that was a good lessons learned. Going on to Sydney here, we talk about arrival into a country or a city. There can't be that much better arrival when you're on the ferry from Manly and you get to Circular Quay. It's a journey I like to take, I even stay in Manly, because having that decompress or excitement of 30 minutes before you get to work is really inspiring. But it's not just a sense of arrival in a country. It's also the connected journey. And this is a poster we did for the Transport Minister of New South Wales at the time. And she was pushing through of how they wanted a multimodal transport offer for New South Wales. And she was trying to push that idea amongst her political colleagues. So we did this poster and we said, it's not just what happens at the front door of a station or a ferry terminal. It's about the end-to-end journey. It's giving people information and confidence at the beginning of their journey to go on their journey, interact with different modes like light rail or ferries or even buses. So you've got to think of a completely ecosystem and holistic approach to transport. Then also, it's not just about, when we talk about multi-modes, things have changed. That was back in 2012. Now we think of the transport offer as active transport, walking, cycling, and some of the work we've been doing with Auckland Transport, which Andy mentioned just before. You would never think that this initiative would be championed to be successful by our client, Auckland Transport. Car was in the culture, definitely. This is back in 2017. And now they've got an extensive cycle network and walking network for people to engage and walk around and enjoy Auckland. Also, working with architects, and in the early days, we hear that actually stations should be seen not just as stations, but they should be seen as civic buildings, and we've really embraced that working in those teams. This shows Melbourne Metro, a project which we started back in 2017 with a team of WWP, RSHP and Hassel architects. And in those very early days, we were looking at the complexity and scale of these stations and the line, and we talked about what an opportunity it was for us. And I remember bidding and us saying this as a group. We are really sort of like proud to be involved in creating civic buildings, probably the first large-scale civic buildings in that city. And also, because of the complexities, we talked about actually how do people navigate in these complex environments now. We talked about bringing the street down to streets under streets. And some of the detail on the line-wide components. RSHP introduced this orange colour. They said it was the orange inspired from the sunsets, the great sunsets in Melbourne. So it's about connecting the design and the infrastructure to the place. Also, on a much smaller scale, what we've seen and what we've been involved in is a sense of space by storytelling in the stations. We've been working with artists on art programs and also looking at the sense of history in those areas and the sense of cultures and this connection to country. And I think that's something we don't do over in the UK, and I'm sure that's something which we could elaborate on and invest in. So how often do we judge a city or a country by the experience of arrival and the onward journey? I think everyone has a 5-minute judgment of when we arrive in a city, whether it's through arrival at an airport or station, and it makes a big effect on you. It's really your first connection with that place and city, and it's vitally important that as designers that we understand that and we make that a most rewarding experience for people. I'm going to finish on a picture, it's a project we've been working on with a number of partners. And I must say that when I come back into Heathrow, I don't take the Heathrow Express anymore. Not that I'm biased, I take the Elizabeth line. But I think what the Elizabeth line has done for London as a city, and also wider for the UK, is that it's brought connectivity straight from the airport into the heart of London, whether that's you're going to the commercial centre of Liverpool Street and Canary Wharf, whether you're going to the culture of Dean Street, the theatre lands, or whether you're going to the shopping of Bond Street. You immediately pass through this calm, intuitive, very futuristic, modern-looking environment, then you pop up into the urban environment, and immediately you're in the centre of London. And I think that is something which we all need to be focused on, is that sense of arrival, that sense of place when we're designing infrastructure. Thank you very much.
If you could use that, that'd be great.
Okay, problem with this?
Yeah, that's all right, okay, but we've got it now,
right,
so it's fine.
Yeah.
So first of all, I'm going to indulge in just a bit of one-on-one. This is a picture that I took this morning.
Oh, really?
Which is pretty much exactly the one that you
is.
showed there. So
Yeah.
we're just having a love fest here, sorry about that. So we'll involve the rest of you in a minute.
It's the first picture I showed, which is that unbelievable view, where you've got the canal and you've got the link of
so clearly I should have been a designer in another life, maybe. There are going to be some opportunity for questions from the floor, so get ready for those. But in the meantime, there are a couple that I just needed to throw to you based on a few things that you said. First one, clarification. What's the difference between a building and a civic building? What do you mean by civic?
Well, I think the magnitude of these stations, basically the care and attention needs to be of a civic. I mean, it's a building for use by everyone in the city, and also it's a statement. It's a statement of intent. It's a statement of the confidence of the city, and that's why we say they're not just stations for trains to be in. They are, and also the stations they serve many functions. You know, events happen, lots of things. It's not just about commuting.
Okay, interesting. The second question you mentioned was about culture and understanding the culture in Shanghai being different to Sydney, I think you have mentioned, and London. So when you have what is a modern, multicultural city, how do you define culture in that environment? How do you get the balance between everybody having to use it and the country that you're in?
Well, I think the key has been to our expansion abroad, is that we're not a fly-in, fly-out practice, delivering international best practice. Our New Zealand office is run by Guy, who worked in London, but he comes from Auckland. He's a Kiwi. Our Australia office is run by Kate Pleben. She comes from Melbourne. So they're invested, just like I'm invested in London as a Londoner, they are invested in their cities. And they understand the culture, they understand the ambition, they understand the frustrations as well. So I think it's really important that you have local people who understand the culture.
So hence your best practice, not necessarily meaning take it from one country and put it into another.
Exactly. I think you can have lessons learned, particularly what didn't go right. So I think there's a macro, but I think you've got to be very aware of, again, the end user. And the end user and their culture and the ambitions of those cities and countries.
And then the third question that came up was with your last slide on the Elizabeth line. I use it, but I also use it from Heathrow and then jump on the tube. And you can see the benefits. This is nice and new and shiny and clear, and that isn't. So how do you integrate into existing projects when you're bringing something new to play?
Well, I think any new line, like the Elizabeth line I worked on, it's always going to look very different to the existing lines. But actually, when I talked about the customer experience, the end-to-end journey, What's important is that you may well be on different lines or in different environments,
Yeah.
which visually are different. But from a wayfinding point of view or a product design point of view, we make sure that we put things like signs or information in the right place so people know where to look.
Okay.
So the continuity of their experience is the same, even though they're in different stations.
Okay. Last question was inspired by a chat that I had with a gentleman in the audience, which was about King's Cross station, and he said, everybody spends, and he used a swear word, so I can't use that one, too much time on the roof. In other words, discussing what the roof costs are going to be rather than the use of it. Do you see that same challenge?
Well, I think why people look at the roof, because it's a magnificent piece of Victorian architecture, and the new roof is what John McCasman and partners done, is an equally interesting structure. So I don't think, and just like the photograph you just showed, and you went and took, and I showed first of all, there's something mesmerising of having that expressive engineering. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I think people will then have these elements of delight and experiences, but the service has still got to be, good as well.
And so where does the balance come between, and I wrote down the term, it's a term my dad always used, style over substance, son. So when you get a roof that we saw there at Melbourne, I think it was, the orange roof, versus cutting the cost and just putting some corrugated plastic over the top, how do you get that balance between style over substance?
Well, transport and infrastructure in general is a very technical, functional, safety critical sector. So that informs any design response. A lot of the design response, whether that's Melbourne, that's a trinocular which was really sort of working very closely with engineers of how we could get this cathedral-like space. Elizabeth Line, you might think that organic flow, not only does it express the flow of people down a tube, that came from working with the engineers, understanding how the spray concrete lining works, and then we basically replicated that because we saw from a passenger experience point of view that that would help us deliver intuitive environments. So a lot of our work, not just Maynard, but the teams we work with in infrastructure, the engineering is what inspires us, and I think that is a very British characteristic.
Yeah, very true.
You can see, like your image, you can see around where's Norman Foster, that type of imagery and that attention to detail, but that functionality serves us well.
Okay. I've taken up far too much of his time. Are there any questions from the floor on the design function? Can we get a microphone over here? Hold it really close. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'll pour it while you listen.
I'm quite intrigued by the sense of place through storytelling you talked about. So we do a bit of this in the UK, particularly on community rail lines. But I was wondering, in the example you shared, what was the driving force behind that? Was it the developer, the commissioner, local community groups, charities, the local authority?
It was in Sydney, it was Sydney Metro, and in Melbourne, it was Melbourne Metro, the state of Victoria. And the state of Victoria, every single station has something, some artwork or some storytelling. And it gives an opportunity to work with the local community, especially the indigenous population, to tell a story, because a lot of the origins of those places are rooted in the culture. So it was government. It was a government initiative, and it's something that we're fortunate to be part of, and we chose to work with our partners to celebrate that. And I think it's interesting you said maybe local stations do that, but when we're doing the large HS2 stations or even some of the stations we've done on the Elizabeth Line, we had an art programme which was very successful, but I think we could maybe in the future look at maybe more of a historical context of place.
There's a question here at the front. Yeah, we can do that afterwards.
Hey, I was just going to ask, in terms of active travel and cycling in particular, how far do you think we have to go in terms of how we compare to globally and in Europe as well, our cycling infrastructure and town planning to promote those forms of active travel, because there are obviously a lot of health benefits for one, public health, it's quite a big social determinant of health outcomes. So yeah, I was just wondering kind of what your perspective is and how much of the barriers are within our control and how far we have to come for that.
Well, I think the UK is quite good at it, actually. But what we've seen, we do a lot of city wayfinding, and we're seeing now that actually it's not the transport authorities necessarily who are commissioning us. It's the Department of Health, because they see the benefits of active travel, not just for physical fitness and activity, but also for the social value of connecting communities, connecting businesses, and things like that. Cycling, I think we've got a very comprehensive cycling system in London, whether it's Cycle Hire or the Cycle Super Highways. I think that's been replicated in other cities in the UK. The biggest thing I think we've got, and the biggest bugbear, is the hire bikes, which are left all over the place. I mean, we do a lot of work in accessibility groups, and I think some of the design details for our street furniture we spend a lot of time and effort on that. But when you've got a litter of bikes in front of it, I think the local councils need to sort out that. I think that's a challenge at the moment, not just in London. We've got scooters in Brisbane, for example, or everywhere. And I think, that's something we need to focus on.
Back in a second. There were quite a few nods for your question at the back, so you're in good company. There was a question over there.
Hiya, thanks very much for the presentation, really interesting. I actually lived in Auckland for 4 years, so great to see some photos and stuff from there. I was just wondering, a little bit intrigued about your comment about Shanghai, and I kind of assumed that with wayfinding, simplest is always best, and you sort of distill everything down to the basic messages you need to do the breadcrumb sort of thing, like you've done so well with the Elizabeth line and so many other places. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the experience you had in Shanghai and how that was different?
We thought that. I mean, we are North European. We come from a culture of monochronic culture where we like a sense of order. We like a sense of a progressive disclosure of information, one step at a time, a rationale to it. What we found in China is a polychronic culture. You only have to look at their streets, as it were. Look at a street in the UK, commercial on the ground floor, sequentially numbered, might be resi above or whatever. That sort of dynamic is very different in Shanghai, for example. Also, culturally, the ability to absorb a lot of information. You've only got to have a look at a Chinese newspaper or website where all the information is delivered to you on the first page. And we try and actually give information in a sequential way. So we get information overload. What causes us stress is too much signage, too much information, and we just go into meltdown. What we did incorrectly in Shanghai was that we got rid of all that information because it was stressing us out and we couldn't work out the logic of anything. And then we cut it all down into a different, very monochronic North European way. And that is what that's why we didn't understand the culture. And, what we should have had is someone on our team who was Chinese, who lived or experienced Shanghai, and in the early days of our design response and our design thinking would say, no, that's not how we think, that's not how information is delivered, and that's not how we absorb information. And I think that's hopefully answers your question.
We're going to have to call it there, but I think a rousing round of applause for Matthew. That's a fantastic session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very nice to meet you.